The snow was still falling outside the hospital windows when I saw Dr. Miriam Forsythe cry for the first time. Not the quiet, composed kind of crying that people do when they think no one is watching. Real crying, the kind that shakes your shoulders and makes you forget where you are. She was standing in the hallway near the staff lounge, half turned toward the wall, one hand pressed flat against the painted cinder block, like she needed something solid to hold on to. And I almost walked past her. I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it. That moment changed everything between us. And I think in some ways, it changed who I am. My name is Ryan Calloway, and 2 years ago I was a second-year nursing student doing my clinical placement at Northgate General Hospital in Sudbury, Ontario. I'd grown up about 40 minutes north of there, in a small town called Chelmsford, where my dad drove a logging truck, and my mom worked the early shift at Tim Hortons most mornings before I was even out of bed. We didn't have a lot, but we had enough, and they raised me with a pretty simple set of values. Show up, work hard, don't complain about things you can't change, and never leave someone alone when they're struggling. That last one is important to what happened. Northgate General was not a glamorous place to do a placement. It wasn't one of the big downtown hospitals in Toronto or Ottawa that nursing students fought over. It was a regional hospital, understaffed like most of them, with flickering fluorescent lights in the east wing that maintenance had been promising to fix since before I started. The parking lot flooded every spring. The cafeteria closed at 2 in the afternoon, so if you were on evenings you were surviving on vending machine granola bar and whatever someone had left in the break room fridge. But the people there were good. The nurses on Ward 4 were the kind of team that actually looked out for each other, covered shifts without being asked, and remembered your name on your first day. I felt lucky to be there. Except for one thing, Dr. Miriam Forsythe. She was the chief of internal medicine, which meant she was everywhere. Ward rounds, case conferences, emergency consults. Wherever the most complicated high-stakes situation was happening, she was already there, 3 steps ahead of everyone else, asking the question nobody had thought to ask yet. She was somewhere in her mid-50s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses. She wore on a chain around her neck. She'd trained at McGill, done a fellowship in London, and had apparently been recruited away from Toronto General about 12 years ago under circumstances nobody seemed to want to explain in detail. The nurses respected her. The residents were terrified of her. And me? I was a student, which meant I was basically furniture to her for the first 3 weeks of my placement. She didn't ignore me out of cruelty. I want to be fair about that. She just had a way of operating that didn't leave much room for people who weren't already up to speed. She moved fast, spoke faster, and expected everyone in her vicinity to be keeping up. If you weren't, she didn't slow down and wait for you. She moved on. The first time she spoke to me directly, it was to tell me that the intake form I'd helped fill out for a patient in bed 7 had 2 errors in the medication history section, and that I needed to redo it before the attending physician arrived. She said it without looking at me, already flipping through a chart, already moving on to whatever came next. I read the form. I checked it 4 times. A few days later, she stopped at the nursing station while I was reviewing a patient's vitals log and said, without preamble, "You're the student from Laurentian?" I said yes. She said, "Your documentation is improving," and walked away. That was the closest thing to a compliment I received from her for the first 6 weeks. By November, I had started thinking seriously about whether I'd made the right choice. Not just about the placement, but about the whole thing. Nursing school, the career, all of it. I'd taken on a second part-time job driving for a delivery app on weekends to cover my rent in Sudbury, and I was tired in a way that felt like it had gotten into my bones. My girlfriend at the time, who was doing her placement in Ottawa, and I had started arguing over things that didn't matter because the real conversation about whether this was all sustainable, about whether we were heading in the same direction, felt too big to have over the phone. I was drafting a message to my faculty advisor one night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee going cold beside me, trying to figure out how to say, "I think I need to take a leave of absence," without it sounding like giving up. I didn't send it that night. But I kept the draft. The annual Hospital Foundation Gala happened in the last week of November. I know, a gala. It sounds like something out of a different world than the one I was living in, and honestly, it was. The Northgate General Foundation raised money every year for equipment upgrades and programs the provincial funding didn't cover, and the gala was their big event. It was held at a hotel ballroom downtown. The kind of place that had real tablecloths and a guy playing piano near the entrance. Staff attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but for clinical students it was strongly encouraged in a way that made it feel like it was. I borrowed a dress shirt from my roommate and showed up alone. The room was full of doctors and administrators and donors who looked like they owned things. I found a spot near the edge of the room with a glass of sparkling water and tried to look like I belonged there. The hospital's executive director gave a speech. Someone from the foundation board gave another speech. The pianist played something that might have been Frank Sinatra, I'm not sure. And then I noticed Dr. Forsythe. She was standing near the far end of the room, close to where the catering staff had set up a side table with coffee urns and desserts that tea was turching. She was by herself. That wasn't unusual at a hospital event. She wasn't known for being social, but something about the way she was standing was wrong. Her posture, which I'd spent 6 weeks learning to read as a kind of barometer for how a situation was going, was off. Too still, too tight. I watched her for a minute. She didn't move toward any of the clusters of conversation happening around the room. She didn't take out her phone. She just stood there holding a glass of wine that she wasn't drinking, staring at nothing in particular. Once she glanced toward the exit. I don't know what made me do it. I genuinely don't. Maybe it was just the Chelmsford in me, that thing my parents had put into me about not walking past someone who's struggling. Maybe I was tired enough that the part of my brain that calculates professional risk had gone offline. But I crossed the room. I introduced myself again, in case she'd forgotten. I said something forgettable about the event. And then, because nothing else seemed right, I asked if she wanted to dance. She looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't recognize. The band had started playing something slow. A few couples were on the small dance floor near the front of the room. I kept my hand out, slightly ridiculous, slightly committed to the idea now that I'd said it. She put her glass down. She took my hand. We didn't speak for the first minute or two. We just moved, slowly, not particularly gracefully, in the general direction of the music. I could feel that her hand was cold. Not just cool the way hands get in November, genuinely cold and slightly unsteady. And when I happened to catch a glimpse of her face, the expression there wasn't anything I'd seen in 6 weeks of working in her orbit. She looked afraid. Not of me, not of the situation. It was the kind of fear that doesn't have a single source, the kind that accumulates. I didn't say anything. I'd learned enough about Dr. Forsythe to know that filling silence was not always the right move, so I just kept moving with the music and I waited. After what felt like a long time, she said, "I owe you an apology." I wasn't expecting that. I told her she didn't. She said, "I've been harder on you than was fair. I do that with students I think can actually handle it. It's not a good habit." I didn't know what to say to that either. I said something like, "It's okay, I think I needed it." She shook her head slightly, like she was dismissing a chart note that didn't add up. No. There's a version of high standards that teaches people, and there's a version that just makes them feel invisible. I crossed that line with you. I'm sorry. The music kept going. Around us, the room hummed along with its own momentum, glasses and laughter and the kind of comfortable noise that fills spaces where people feel safe. But where we were, it felt different. Quieter. I told her that I'd been thinking about dropping out. She stopped moving for just a moment. Then she started again. "I know," she said. That surprised me enough that I actually asked how. She was quiet for a second. Then she said she'd seen an email I'd sent to one of the unit educators a few weeks earlier, asking about the process for withdrawing from a placement mid-cycle. The educator had flagged it and looped her in, as was apparently standard when a student seemed to be struggling. She had read it. She hadn't done anything about it. "I told myself you'd work through it," she said. That seemed easier than having the conversation. A pause. That was the wrong call. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd been so certain, for 6 weeks, that she didn't know I existed beyond what was written on my intake forms. And the whole time, she'd known I was close to walking away, and she'd been watching and saying nothing. I asked her why she'd stayed in Sudbury. It seemed like an odd thing to ask, but it came out before I could think about whether it was appropriate. She didn't seem to mind. She said she'd left Toronto General because the politics had started to feel more real than the patients. That up here, there were fewer places to hide from the actual work. She said she'd never regretted the move, but that some nights, some events like this one, surrounded by people who didn't know her and probably thought they did, she felt very far from anything that made sense. Then she told me what had actually been weighing on her that night. 3 days earlier, She'd received a formal complaint from the college. Not about patient care, about her, about a supervision decision she'd made during a case in September, when she'd allowed a resident to perform a procedure with less direct oversight than the guidelines technically required. The resident had done well, the patient had recovered fully, but someone had filed a complaint, and now there was a review process, and she was looking at months of documentation requests and formal responses, and the very real possibility that her clinical privileges could be temporarily suspended while they sorted it out. 12 years of practice at Northgate, 26 years of medicine, and now she was standing in a hotel ballroom, holding a glass of wine she couldn't bring herself to drink, wondering if a decision she'd made because she trusted someone had just unraveled everything. I listened. I didn't try to fix it because I couldn't. I didn't say it would be fine because I didn't know that. I just kept listening. She said the worst part wasn't the complaint itself. The worst part was that she hadn't told anyone, not the other physicians she'd worked with for over a decade, not her department administrator. She'd been carrying it alone since Tuesday, going through rounds and case conferences, and the daily machinery of the ward as if nothing had shifted, because showing that something had shifted was not something Miriam Forsythe did. The song was winding toward its end. The piano slowed. A few of the couples on the dance floor began drifting back toward their tables. She looked up at me. She was shorter than I'd registered somehow, or maybe I'd just never been this close to her before, and her expression had changed. Not warm, exactly, but open in a way I hadn't seen before. She said, "You're going to be a very good nurse." I told her I wasn't sure about that anymore. She said, and then, very quietly, like she wasn't sure she should say it at all, "And I need people like you to stay. This hospital needs you to stay. So please, whatever you're dealing with, don't make the decision yet. Give it more time." The music stopped. We stepped apart the way you do when the reason for standing close to someone has officially ended, but neither of us moved away immediately. And then she said something I've turned over in my mind probably 100 times since. She said, "I've spent most of my career being the person who doesn't need anyone to stand beside her. I'm starting to think that was a mistake." Then she picked up her glass from the table where she'd left it, thanked me for the dance, and walked back toward the room. The next morning, I deleted the draft message to my faculty advisor. I don't want to oversell what happened at that gala, because it wasn't magic. The weeks that followed were still hard. My delivery app shifts were still exhausting. My relationship with my girlfriend didn't survive the winter, though that had more to do with us than with anything else. The fluorescent light in the East Wing still flickered. The cafeteria still closed at 2, but something had shifted. Dr. Forsythe didn't transform into a different person. She was still exacting, still fast, still the kind of presence that made junior staff straighten up involuntarily when she entered a room. But there were small things. She started using my name when she spoke to me, which sounds minor except that she hadn't before. She began including me in the briefcase discussions she had with residents at the nursing station. Not for show, but genuinely. It's asking what I'd observed, and then listening to the answer. Once in early December, she asked me to explain my reasoning on a monitoring decision I'd flagged on a patient file. I expected her to find the flaw in it. Instead, she said, "That's exactly right," and moved on. It was 4 words. It stayed with me for a week. About 6 weeks after the gala, she told the ward team that she'd been dealing with a professional complaint and that the review process was ongoing. She said it matter-of-factly, standing at the nursing station during handover, like it was just another piece of information the team needed to have. People nodded. Someone asked if there was anything they could do. She said she'd let them know, that was all. But I understood what it had cost her to say even that much. The review eventually concluded in the spring. The college determined that her supervision decision had fallen within acceptable clinical judgment, given the resident's documented competency level and the specific circumstances of the case. Her privileges were never suspended. She was required to complete some additional documentation training, which she apparently went through with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. I finished my placement in January and returned to Laurentian to complete my final semester. I graduated that April in one of those big university gymnasiums with folding chairs and a sound system that kept cutting out. My parents drove down from Chelmsford. My dad wore the blazer he'd bought for my uncle's retirement party and kept tugging at the collar. My mom cried, which she'd promised she wouldn't do. I went back to Northgate General on a casual basis over the summer, picking up shifts when they needed coverage. In September, a permanent position opened on Ward 4 and I applied and got it. I'm still there. I don't see Dr. Forsythe every day. Internal medicine and the ward floor run on different rhythms, but we cross paths regularly, and when we do, there's something there that wasn't there before. Not friendship exactly, because the hierarchy is still real and we both know it, but a kind of recognition. Like two people who saw each other clearly once at an odd moment in a hotel ballroom in November, and neither of them has quite forgotten it. She still moves fast. She still asks the question nobody else thought to ask. The residents are still a little scared of her, and honestly I think some of that is useful. It keeps them sharp. But there are things people know about her now that they didn't before. That she'll tell you when something's going wrong. That she doesn't always have the answer. That asking for help is not, in her estimation, the same as failing. She told me once, this was just a few months ago, in passing, coming out of a consultation room, that she'd been thinking about mentoring a student again next placement cycle. That she'd been hard on students in the past in ways that weren't always productive. And she wanted to try something different. I told her I thought she'd be good at it. She gave me the look she gives when she thinks someone is being imprecise, and said, I think I'll be better at it than I was. That's the kind of distinction Miriam Forsythe makes. She doesn't accept approximations, not even about herself. There's a moment, sometimes, when I'm doing rounds late in the evening, and the ward gets quiet in that particular way it does after visiting hours end. The lights lower, the sound changes, and it feels for a minute like you can actually hear the building breathe. When I think about that night in November, the snow outside, the borrowed dress shirt, a woman I thought was made entirely of certainty, holding my hand and trembling. I think about how close I came to not being here, and I think about what it means that the person who kept me here was someone I'd spent months assuming didn't even know my name. Leadership, I've come to believe, doesn't look the way they describe it in textbooks. It's not about standing at the front of the room or having the right answer first. Sometimes it looks like a woman in her mid-50s, standing alone at the edge of a party, finally letting someone see that she's carrying something heavy. And sometimes it looks like staying, even when leaving feels easier, because someone you respect looked at you and said, I need you here. I stayed, and that turned out to be enough.